Battle Network 3 was the first game in the series that I played. I was still a kid back then and had to choose what games to buy with the money I saved up carefully. 3 just happened to be the most easily available of the titles when I was finally in a position to try the Mega Man spin-off, and one of my siblings also joined me, picking up the opposite version at the same time, me white and him blue. Since this is one of the more popular entries, I could have certainly done worse. Heck, 1 or 4 could have easily turned me off the series entirely, so I'd say I'd lucked out. That said, while I remember liking the game, since I wound up playing the rest afterwards, sometimes multiple versions, my memories of this one are pretty hazy. I've been looking forward to giving this one another go, to refamiliarize myself with a game that I've largely forgotten, and to see if it's as hard as I remember as well. After all, if I thought this was one of the more challenging ones, it could have been due more to inexperience than intrinsic difficulty. I'm Wes, the Explosion, and now that I've finally cleared both white and blue, I'm ready to review the set. Lan and Mega Man have now saved the world from an evil organization twice, so of course, this game starts out really big, with them on a field trip. Okay, most of these start off with school stuff. Lan is 11 after all, so I can probably cut out the sarcasm. Anyway, after some shenanigans with his friends, it's soon revealed that the WWW is back, and this time Wily needs 4 really powerful programs to end all of Net Society. This isn't even a spoiler. Each of the villains spells out their plans in more and more detail each encounter. They are terrible at keeping secrets. Just like Lan's terrible at sharing them, since I don't think he tells any adult or ally all the dirt the WWW continually spills on themselves. Alongside this is the N1 Grand Prix, a net battler tournament being put on by the local TV station and being broadcast worldwide. While it seems pretty silly to treat something that starts out feeling like it was put together pretty helter-skelter so seriously, I do love a good tournament arc. It leads to some pretty fun situations and culminates in probably my favorite chapter in the game, so when it concludes about halfway through the story, it's a little sad. While the foundation's pretty solid, the return of a previous threat, this time considerably stronger, and some fun anime bullcrap thrown in, I remain mixed on the story. On one hand, there's some really great character development with Dex and Chaude. They also really show off Lan's character, him often prioritizing people over whatever dumb thing you would expect a kid to be fixated on. While I always like Lan, I got a really great impression of what a good kid he is in this one, which is why it kinda bothers me how much crap the story gives him this time, and how harshly he's judged at points. While I think he's pretty mature for his age, at times, the game seemed to expect him to have the wisdom of a full-grown adult. Mega Man, likewise, has some good moments of true heroism, and no one tries to make him feel like a bad guy for doing so I like his parts. Another issue I had was them backsliding with the character motivations. About half of the bad guys seem to have a reason for what they're doing, but the rest just seem to be being evil because Wily said so. Maybe I'm expecting too much here, but after Gospel's group, where I had a pretty good idea of where everyone was coming from, it was a little disappointing. Back to the positive though, the story does have some fun twists and turns, and a pretty memorable and emotional conclusion, as well as some interesting world building and lore stuff, even if a good chunk of it never gets addressed again. I'd love to talk more in depth about some things, but I don't want to drop any heavy spoilers, so maybe I'll do a plot discussion video at some point, but the gist is, the story's half decent, a definite improvement over 1's, but I still think 2's tops it. And Lan is great, so they should be nice to him. Game mechanics have seen a few shakeups. For the simple ones, chips have been broken up into 3 categories. Standards are standard, and you can still only have up to 5 copies of one in your folder. Megas are a step up. You can only have 5 in rotation with no duplicates, most Navi chips falling into this classification. And Gigas are the strongest, so you can only have 1 total in your deck. Bug frags are back, but rather than just finding them in specific data drops, now you get them from battles. Take out an enemy right before they attack, get a bug frag. Take out 2 that way, get 3. Take out 3 and get 8. Defeat a boss in the same way and get 10. Once again, there are special shops where you can spend these, but since it's a renewable resource this time, the prices have gone up. Still, I think I prefer things this way. There's also the Virus Breeder. Encounter a special set of viruses at a specific part of the net, and defeating them will have them warm up to you and you adopt them like pets. This gives you a special chip that summons one of them, like a Navi chip. Feed them bug frags to make them stronger, and eventually unlock a higher level version of them that you can add to your forces as well. It's cute, I guess. The biggest addition this time around though is the Navicust. You get programs to put into a grid, with a few rules like only solids on the command line and no same color programs touching. If you mess up, you experience bugs in combat, stuff like screwing up your controls or your buster misfiring. You can get upgrades to expand the grid, as well as allow you to spin the programs. While HP memories remain, this replaces the buster power-ups from the last game, you needing programs to increase things like attack and charge. You can also use the Navicust to increase your health, attract specific types of viruses, and change the terrain, among other things. As the name implies, it's a great way to customize your loadout and how you play. While there's a part of me that likes the power-ups more, since they function more as a checklist with a fixed endpoint, I do have to admit that this is almost certainly better, and you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. In fact, I'd praise the system to high heaven if it weren't for one little thing. That being the programs you need for story progression. The first one you get, Press, allows you to shrink down and walk across narrow passages. It doesn't take up much space, and it's only one, so it's not really a big deal, but as you go along, you get one that lets you use chips to destroy certain obstacles, which you probably want to combine with another that makes it more likely you'll encounter viruses with the chips you need, and another that you only need to talk to a few NPCs for a few minutes. They all have different dimensions, so they can completely upend the configuration that you've carefully assembled, for something that you need only briefly, and while you can just swap back once you're done, it is still a chore. I have ADHD, I have trouble with this. It gets a lot better post-game though, when the only program you really need is the aforementioned Press. It has the same shape and color as Undershirt, which lets you live fatal damage at 1 HP, and is something you probably want equipped at all times. You could either look at this as them being cruel, you possibly needing to choose between being able to travel and staying alive, or as them giving you an easy shuffle. Either way, it's a pretty good system, it just has some kinks to work out. There's also been some changes to the style change. Guts no longer kills your rapid stat, but instead gives you a machine gun buster if you jam on the shoot button, and blocking with shield heals you as well. While custom and team function pretty much the same, they have a new special function where, if you take out a Navi with team fast enough, or you defeat a virus with only chips, though no Navis, using custom, you get a special chip as a reward. And now, rather than level up strengthening your charged attacks, you instead get programs that either replicate or buff what the style can already do, such as further increasing the number of chips you get each turn for custom, or eliminating flinch for guts. There's even a program that you can find that pretty much gives you hub style, which is missing from the normal rotation this time around. And while the elements associated with each are the same, there's also 3 new styles. You get ground by breaking or otherwise changing panels, and this will let you crack panels with charged attacks. Shadows obtained by using a lot of invis chips. I was under the impression that it would turn you invisible when you used a charge shot, but when I unlocked it, it instead replaced my charge shot with going intangible. Really glad I didn't write this up without trying it out myself. I got wood element for each, oddly enough. Wood ground feels a little awkward to use, though I could see aqua or heat ground really wrecking, their bubbler and flamethrowers eliminating a lot of the enemy's footholds. This style did prove really useful against Yamato Man though. I need to play around with wood shadow more, though I do like the idea of just disappearing, then countering with a strong chip. Both also have some really good programs you get from leveling them up, ground's changing the terrain, while shadow allows you to just ignore the floor. So even if they aren't really your style, I think that makes them worth at least grinding out. Lastly, there's bug style, which you get by causing errors in your Navicust. This gives you 3 random bugs at the start of a fight, 2 positive and 1 negative. I'm not much of a gambler, so this is the last one I got. I've gotten a few good turns with it, where I've gotten some really good buffs while not even noticing whatever the consequences were, and there's been other times where it's completely screwed me over. So I'll probably be dropping it as soon as I finish leveling it. I'm a big fan of style changes, so I love them adding in more variety. There is a major caveat though. Last time you could hold up to 2 at a time, but in 3 you can only have 1. Since the big thing seems to be grinding up each to get their programs, I get how they probably wanted people to be constantly cycling through them, so that they can get everything and maybe settle into one of their favorites once they're finally done, but I still like having different options for different situations. There's more styles available, which makes the choice even more difficult, and perhaps most significantly, you need two of the styles, Team and Custom, to complete your chip libraries and 100% the game. While it's not too hard to manipulate which style you get, it does take 100 battles to do so, which will likely take over an hour. And given that you can just randomly get an element that doesn't really work for you, you could still wind up with something you don't want, even after investing the time. I'm working on post-game stuff myself at the moment, and having to figure out whether I want to go custom for chips, team for navies, or guts for something to buff me is a little frustrating. One style at a time feels really limiting, and while asking for them to just let you swap to anything you've ever unlocked at any time might be a little too busted, I think they should have at least given you more than one style change slot at a time. While this isn't the worst thing in the world, it still feels like a way to stretch things out. Of course, this matters significantly less if you're not going for all the extra stuff, and overall, what they've given us here really lets you customize your loadout and how you play, so it's largely positive. They continue to expand your options in the human world, like last game, having there be 4 areas you can reach by metro, but then having a few extra locations you can reach from the last place you unlock. ACDC is largely the same, with the school and homes, but unlike last time, the chip shop is open. Woohoo! Scilab is once again some hallways and elevators, but with all the monitors and consoles about, it at least looks a lot cooler than a bunch of freshly buffed floors and covered desks, even if both serve the same purpose. Yoka is a hot springs village with an inn, zoo, and food stalls, so while quaint, it does look like a nice place to visit. Beach Street has the most going on. While it has a cafe and a few buildings there to make it look fuller, the points of note are the hospital, TV station, shore, and dock. The first two are comparable to Scilab in size, and from the last one, you can take a boat to get to Hades Island, a location set up by the TV station to look like hell for one of the N1 Grand Prix rounds, and the final area, which is a pretty spiffy Widely base. While this doesn't take you to another country like 2 did, there's still a lot of places for you to explore and interact with, so it feels like you're really getting your money's worth. And while still greatly expanding the number of places you can go, since it is kept local, you don't run into the problem of having to go through several screens just to reach one location in particular. While I do appreciate the wider scope some of the other games go for, I like how this one keeps things cozy but still manages to feel pretty big at the same time. Now on to the net spaces and the associated missions in each chapter. The main net is broken up into 4 main areas, matching the main parts of the human world. Each has 2, maybe 3 screens, and you can move from area to area by using a cyber metro. Most of the main paths are labeled with an eye-catching color, so it's a lot harder to get lost this time around, and given how each chapter has you doing stuff in these spaces, it's greatly appreciated. And as usual, beyond these is the undernet, which is a lot more twisted up, so coming up with a method of feeling out the paths you need is a lot more important here. As for the dungeons, this game's a bit lighter on them, only half the chapters having one. You start out in the school complex, where the lights blink on and off, so you have to watch out for mystery data to get the keys you need to progress. It's a pretty short one, but I could see the flashing lights screwing with some people, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. And since it also tests how well you can pay attention, I don't think it's bad. Next is the zoo complex, which visually reminds me of some sort of kid's book, with its cute animal graphics on the floor and the silhouettes in the background. It feels appropriate, since the puzzles in this area remind me of Sesame Street. Viruses block the way, and you have to find the right Mr. Prog that matches up with the hint they give. Stuff like a lonely rabbit needing a companion, or the tree getting felled by a beaver. It's cute, if a little silly. Then there's the hospital, which has vines that you need to burn to find switches. I'm not the biggest fan of this one, since getting through it requires a special program in your Navicust, with the second one being recommended. You needing to burn through your actual chips, which I work hard to collect, and the hints just being pretty garbage at points. That said, you are given access to the chip restocks you need, so with a bit of patience, you can grind some out to continue advancing, and since there's no limit to how many you can get, you can brute force your way through the stage if which patches you need to burn isn't obvious. Then there's the final level, which has boss refights and UFO catchers that will send you back to the start or midpoint of a screen if they get you. There's also a few gooey boys hiding out that will do the same, though you can either see them with a Navicus program or just memorize where they are since they're in fixed spots. Some of the catchers feel a little bull though, since the hitboxes on them seem to be a bit bigger than the shadows they cast, and they can also get synced up at point to be just unpassable. But given that it's pretty easy to save and reset at any point, you can get through it with a bit of persistence. So what does the other half of the game do? Well, the rest take place largely on the main net. One chapter has you playing hide and seek with some baddies, which might sound annoying, but since they tell you which area they're in and none are too big, it's not actually too bad. Then there's the main tournament chapter, where you have to do a few things like travel around a small area that's kind of connected to the net, but for the most part, this is the battle chapter. This is the fastest section of the game, and admittedly, probably my favorite. While I enjoy most parts of 3, I just think that boss battles are the highlights, and this certainly gives you your money's worth. Then there's the chapter where you have to put out fires in all the main sections of the net. It's similar to the hospital complex, but here, you burn aqua chips instead of heat, you need to put out all of them, rather than just a specific one, and some sections don't even have aqua viruses to restock your chips, so you could end up needing to take a field trip if your current supply doesn't hold. Really hate this mission, given the limited ability to get the resources you need, but at least they're nice enough to tell you when you're done in an area. Then there's also a mission where you have to enter a fight club and make it to the top, or at least close to top. It consists largely of fighting one guy, then getting a hint as to where the next in line is. While a few are a little obtuse, most of them are the sort that you can puzzle out, and since this one has a lot of scripted virus battles and a few extra bosses, I did have a good time with it. It's kind of odd how they put in so many extra real-world locations, yet seem to pare back considerably on the net ones. That said, I did have fun with most of the story, other than the 2 where I had to sacrifice chips to get through, and even then, the one where you have to extinguish fires is the only chapter I would absolutely condemn. It feels like they were experimenting a bit here, and while I do prefer more traditional dungeons, I also wouldn't call it a failure. We have another mix of old and new viruses. The variety feels a little low throughout the main game, but they start throwing a lot at you once you reach the end and post-game. Most encounters are also not too terrible, the nasty enemy combos tending to pop up either in scripted battles or post-game again, when they really step things up. It kinda gives the impression that the game is really holding out, or maybe holding back would be more accurate. While I do think that some of the late stuff would be way too hard to put in earlier, at the same time, stuffing so many viruses in the last few areas feels like a waste, and I wish they would have balanced the roster around the full game a bit better. Still, my complaints aside, they do have some pretty interesting viruses here. Like the horn that can temporarily make its allies invincible, the gun cannons that scroll their targeting systems between rows so that you have to deftly move between them, and the virus pairs that move about the field together so that you need to kill them simultaneously, otherwise its partner will revive it. I'm also glad to see the return of Shrimpies, Powies, and of course the Mets, so while this isn't my favorite set of viruses, I still do really like them. As for bosses, the team finally finishes the Mega Man 2 roster. At least with the remaining members that it's going to acknowledge. But hey, along with Flash, Metal, and Bubble, we get a mix of new guys and folks from various classic games, with 6 also getting 3 reps in. It's a good looking group, and when it comes to the fights, there's a good bit of variety. Flashman tries to stun, then follow up. Metal Man has a lot of moving parts that you need to juggle. Beast Man moves around quick before jumping next to you to attack. Bubble Man hides in the back and takes cheap shots. King Man tries to box you in. Desert Man puts obstacles in your way that you have to contend with, and disappears after being hit by anything that isn't an aqua attack. Plant Man seems straightforward, until he uses vines and flowers to invade your side of the field. Flame Man is easy to avoid, but he has 2 candles that make him hard to kill unless you're constantly taking them out, and drill blocks in front of himself, so you need to hit him from weird angles. I don't much care for fighting Base, since you need to do 100 damage in one shot to take down his aura and hurt him, and he can just randomly regenerate the barrier, which can feel really cheap if you haven't even had much time to hit him while it's down. And the final boss is a devil, so it gets a pass. It has a good variety of attacks, especially at low health, and you need to hit it a few times to expose the core, but I don't think it's as annoying as Base's Life Aura. It's not unbeatable, you just need to get into a groove and hold on. What I find so interesting about this group is how different the fights are. While the final bosses, as well as though in the post-game, are just straight up hard, it feels a bit more relative when it comes to the rest of the story. While their HP is appropriate for when you fight them, each tests a different skill. If your reflexes and dynamic vision are good, Beastman could be easy. If you have piercing attacks, Desert Man shouldn't be a big deal. If you have a strong buster, you can take down Flame Man's candles quick and save the heavy hitting chips for the boss himself. And so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say here is that who's hard and who's easy comes down largely to playstyle, and different people are going to have different answers to who the worst boss is, regardless of when in the story you fight them. It's a breath of fresh air compared to BN2's pattern of just crowding you out so that it was hard to move, let alone attack, or, in a few cases, just refusing to take damage. They did a really good job creating these fights. There are two versions this time around, blue and white. While the blue makes sense, not sure why it's paired with white, though given what color the main character is, I think it's safe to say there's a favorite here. Anyway, there are a ton of little aesthetic changes, from warmer colors in White's park to cooler ones in blue, different trash receptacles, and even something as simple as a barely noticeable change in color in a character's hospital robe. Some of the scripted virus battles also have different configurations between versions. These things are minimal and make the games feel almost like a round of spot the differences, but since I'd only ever played White before, I got a lot more excited than I should have every time I noticed one. More significantly, each edition also has exclusive chips you can find. You can trade though, so we're doing the Pokemon thing. At least we have online functions this time. And remember those new style changes? Aside from Bug, the other two are version exclusives, White getting Ground and Blue getting Shadow. Not the other way around. You'd have to be an idiot to mix those up and spend the entire time up until endgame of your second playthrough trying to get the wrong one, and no one should probably be listening to your review right now. Once again though, you can trade styles, so once again, it's Pokemon. Lastly, and this is probably the most significant for me, the games have exclusive bosses. White gets Mistman, a purple genie that has a lot of tricks up his sleeve, and the best strat seems to be hitting him before he hits you to interrupt whatever he's up to. Chapter 7 of Blue replaces Mistman with Bowlman, which, he does bowling things. Okay, so his one attack involves firing off a lot of pins, which is very similar to one of Base's attacks, so it's good practice. He can also summon pins, which he can knock down to have them bounce your way, so the big thing is just watching what he does and to keep moving. They're both pretty fun to fight. On top of that, Blue also gets Punk and White gets nothing in exchange, which is lame. I feel like I have to be missing the trade-off here. Still though, while I like Punk's design the best, his fight is a little frustrating. He constantly moves around, making him hard to hit, and has a good variety of attacks, so he's hard to deal with. I probably just need to practice him more, but even though I managed to beat him both times we fought, and since you only get his chip through download, all I got was 100 Zenny each time, which shakes out to about $1. Kind of wish there was a bit more of a reward for taking him out, but to do all that work for minimal returns doesn't seem worth it. There are other bosses I can farm. Not sure how other people feel about this, but the two versions don't really seem necessary. Sure, style changes of bosses are cool, but there are few of these and everything else just doesn't feel significant. It doesn't seem like enough to justify things, having just enough to make it feel like you're missing out while not being worth shelling out cash for the other cartridge. While it's nice that the Legacy Collections lets us have both in one, at the same time, one, maybe two late game fights probably won't be enough for most people to invest another 20 hours to see. I guess these games were a bigger deal in Japan, so two versions there might have made more sense, but it still feels like a waste that I had to waste 15-20 years to fight Bowlman. Anyway, if I had to recommend one over the other, I'd pick White, but that's nostalgia talking for the most part. Sure, I do like Mistman a lot more than Bowl, but at the same time, a whole extra boss battle and Shadow style seeming a bit more viable, and I have to admit that Blue is probably the better deal. 3 has another pretty great soundtrack. Most of the real-world locations have songs that I describe as easy listening. Other than Yoka, which annoys me somehow, and the emergency occurrence, which is really stressful with how short and panicked it sounds. The main series theme and AC/DC Town have been punched up just a bit to add some pep. As for the networld, the main area has another chill track, though it can feel a little inappropriate when you're trying to stop it from burning down. Still like it though. One of my favorite tracks is Blind Mode for the school network, where you fight Flashman. The zoo's Maze of Wildness sounds a little goofy, which works well with the pretty silly word association game they have you playing. And the Great Battlers track, which plays for N1 fights, really gets me wishing that it was used for all boss battles. Not that I dislike the standard. I think the big winner for me though is the special theme for this game that gets remixed for several occasions, like for the N1 Grand Prix build-up, the sad Wiping Tears track, the final stage, and the credits Farewell. There's even a vocal version of that last one on the soundtrack that almost makes me a little emotional. Anyway, 2 of these might just be my favorite tracks this round, and it gives the game its own identity, which I'm really glad they didn't just stick to using the main theme that they've had since the first game. While a few songs fall flat for me, for the most part, the music here is really good and enhances the general experience. While I'll admit, I'm a little torn on whether most people would be able to appreciate it outside of the context of the Game Boy Advance has a pretty specific sort of sound, which I do think makes it hard to separate. And I don't have too much to say about visuals. Recurring things continue to largely have their sprites ported over, as far as I can tell, and the newer things continue to look just a bit more detailed and sharper as the people making these got more accustomed to the hardware, like you'd expect. While I'd say I like the environments in the last game a bit more, I can't quite put my finger on why, so that may be bias. It could be due to just how big a jump there was between 1 and 2, making the latter stand out more, or my love for that title in particular. There is one area where I can articulate my issue pretty well though, and that's the main net. I talked about how this time around, the paths are color-coded, each area reserving the most striking color to mark the way to the net square, with past the secondary locations like the Cyber Metro having others used. While I do find this brilliant and applaud the thought that went into it, at the same time, it does have things looking a little dull. While they vary up the color schemes a bit, each of the main areas end up looking like a bunch of plexiglass or tile rectangles floating in space. A lot of the details that made the last game stand out are gone, though it was easier to get lost at points. I guess what it comes down to is function versus fashion, and given how often you have to run around the main net in this game, I can't help but wish it was just a bit easier to look at, especially given how some of the dungeons look. In the hospital network, you get to walk over syringes while pills go flying by. The school's dark but has some flashing lights to keep you awake, and even the undernet, which is connected to the main net, has dilapidated walkways with a background that looks like what you'd expect to see on a broken monitor. It's only a part of the game and not a deal breaker, but it at least bugged me a bit. It also doesn't help that endgame, the main net gets the color drained out, becoming various shades of gray and making things even duller. The difficulty's a little more refined compared to the previous entries. When it comes to battling, the random encounters don't have too many combinations where a little bit of bad luck will feel like a possible death sentence, and each boss battle feels just right for when it comes up. Of course, all of this only applies to the main game. The secret area has a ton of strong enemies with weird stage effects, most commonly ice, that are blocked off by security cubes that you need to beat the third versions of a boss to open. Not only that, but to get these forms, you need to find the second in a specific spot, like usual, but now V3s show up randomly in a different location, some pretty obscure, rather than the same area. It's even more of a scavenger hunt this time around. Luckily, there's GameFAQs, but teenage me with dial-up would have never figured this stuff out. If you want to get all the chips, you also have to beat specific opponents with specific styles with specific criteria, and for each Navi's version 5, you have to type in a code to unlock their Omega form and take them down. It's enough to make your head spin. The main game isn't without its own challenge though, some of it feels a lot less on purpose. Several chapters require you to click on specific stuff, like the zoo scene where you have to look at everything. there being no hints on what you missed, and it took me longer than it should have to figure out that I talked to the people in front of the panda enclosure, rather than the exhibit itself. Or the room in Wily's base where you have to click on both statues to advance, but you have to do the right one after the left, so you could interact with everything and still not do what you needed to. In addition to that, there are some pretty bad hints in this one. One tells you to seek out the place of battle, in a game called Battle Network, but even if you limit it to the tournament you fought in, that still only narrows it down to several locations. One of many birds refers to a bunch of origami cranes in a hospital room that looks more like a coat, and when you have to burn the vines in the hospital complex, the hints tell you based on rows and columns, but patches are diagonal, so what's considered back left kind of is based on how you tilt your head. Then there's the constant swapping with the Navi Custa points and the mission where you have to burn through your aqua chips to put out fires in areas with no aqua viruses to replenish your stash. There's just several spots like this that feel a little poorly executed, but that said, I don't think things are nearly as frustrating as they could be in the previous two games. And for the worst of it, either a walkthrough or patience should get you through. To sum it up, while there are still some hiccups, Battle Network 3 feels like it has a pretty well-balanced difficulty for the main game, and a truly challenging and overwhelming post, for those who found the story's 8 chapters too easy. While Battle Network 3 isn't my favorite, I can definitely see why this entry is so popular. My biggest complaints can either be solved by using a walkthrough, or will only affect those going for 100%, so for the vast majority of players, I don't think these will be issues. While post-game certainly isn't for the faint of heart, just the game in general is something I can easily recommend to anyone interested in the series. I personally really loved revisiting this game that I had only vague memories of, and not only re-experiencing the story, but going beyond that, making it into areas that I was not nearly good enough to tackle on my first outing. While this is the first one to make me doubt whether I'll be able to 100% it, I plan to keep going with it a bit longer. So what do other people think? Is this your favorite, second favorite, close to the top? Do you prefer blue or white? Am I fixating on small annoyances too much, and is the game nigh perfect? Will anyone new to the series look into giving this one a try? With this one down, we're halfway through the games and done with the first Legacy collection, but with everything else having 2 versions, the rest might take a bit longer. So thanks for watching, maybe consider subscribing if you like Mega Man, and perhaps I'll see you next time. For everlasting peace.